everyone, welcome back to Midweek at the Campus. My name's Jake and I'm one of the pastors here. And we're having some additional conversations based on our previous sermon series called Origins. Because mixed into that, we were learning all about the history of the Campus Church. And today's no different because we are going to be joined by our former senior pastor, Dale Hummel. Dale was a senior pastor from the late 90s and through the 2000s, and he was the predecessor to our current senior pastor, Jeff Griffin. We're going to hear all about how God was at work through Dale's time here and some of his experiences. So without further ado, let's get to that conversation with Dale Hummel right now. Dale, thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
So I wanted to start out just by asking how you ultimately got to the Evangelical Free Church of Naperville. What were you doing ahead of time? And how did you sense God's call to ultimately land in the suburbs of Chicago?
Well, Marcia, my wife, and I had moved out to California, and I was pastoring a Baptist church in near, I guess you would say, San Francisco Bay Area. And God blessed us there. We grew, our family grew. We had our 3 children, and we were enjoying ministry and maxing out the campus where we were, as well as seeing lots of people come to faith in Christ. And then we kind of capped out. And what I mean by that is we were in a really tiny location, like about 2 acres, and the building was part of that. And we were running out of parking space because we were running close to 800 people, and so it was becoming very challenging. And there's really nowhere else to go because the area was so heavily populated and there were so many buildings, and it was pretty anti-church at that point. So we knew that if we were going to expand, we'd have to go so far away, we would basically lose our constituency. And so I just sensed a wrestling in my spirit that there was more, and we began to wait on the Lord to see what that would look like. And a friend of mine by the name of Dennis Baker, who had kind of come in to help us as a church, told me about this church back in Chicagoland. And as soon as I heard the word Chicago, I thought, never. I do not want to go back to the Midwest to snow and cold, because we'd moved out of Ohio. And I had lived in Michigan, from the moment my parents came back from the mission field. I'd gone to school in Minnesota, so I had enough cold. But he said, well, at least talk to them. So a guy by the name of Richard Christak, who was the chair of the search team that EFCN had in those days, happened to be in California on some business. So Marcia and I got together with him. And we had a great conversation, and then his invitation was, well, why don't you come back and meet our staff? So I agreed to do that. I'll never forget, we flew back here to Naperville and met the staff, got to know a little bit more about the church. It was a good experience, but we walked away with a sense of that this just isn't where God's going to call us. So we went back to California feeling like this was finished. And then we got a call back from Rich, and he said, hey, we'd love for you to come back again and meet with the elders. And I told Rich, I said, I just not feeling like this is where God, is going to want us. And he said, well, just at least try it. So we boarded a plane and we headed back, and both Marcia and I agreed, unless God spoke to us in a way that was so clear that this was not where we were going to be. So I remember we went to Steve Geary, who at that time was head of the elder board, and we met with the elders in the home. We had Lou Manalotti's pizza, my first exposure, so that was really good, and that was really part of the calling. Just kidding. But we met there. We met the elders, and afterwards we went back to the Courtyard Marriott on Deal Road, and Marcia and I looked at each other, and without talking to each other, we both had that look and that feeling, oh my goodness, I think God just spoke to us that this is where we're supposed to be. I was so impressed by the elders. I was impressed by their love for the Lord and the vision they had and wanting to see God move in a powerful way. And we just felt a real kindred spirit with them. And so all of a sudden our world got kind of messed up. And we went back home and prayed more about it. And were asked to come and to officially candidate. And as they say, that's the rest of the story. God just moved from that point on, and we said goodbye to a wonderful congregation in California and came here and started the adventure together.
So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit of what you know that EFCN was like before you became the senior pastor.
Well, I know from its earliest years, because it was birthed out of Wheaton, right? The Wheaton Evangelical Free Church. I know that they came to Naperville with a sense of being a gospel witness in that community. Well, I mean, look what's happened in Naperville, from the small little farm town to what it is today, right? So I thank God for the people who had the vision to say, let's go out there and start a ministry and a church that can make a difference. Because in many ways, they laid a great foundation. And subsequent to that, people like me have just come along and have built on that foundation. And I watch, Jeff coming now, and he's building, even further on that foundation. God's using him and you and the entire team to expand that, and it's going to go beyond all of that. But in every church, you have what we call pillars, right? And that's those men and women who have been faithful throughout the years with their prayers and with their giving and with their service. And one guy that comes to mind, he's now home with the Lord, was Spence Sawyer. I met him early on when I came and interviewed him. And he was kind of like the E.F. Hutton of the church, so to speak. Been around a long time, truly a man of God, and a man who spoke great and wonderful wisdom. And just knowing that there were people like him here years before I ever arrived allowed me to know that a good, deep, and solid foundation existed here. And, Spence was the kind of guy that could back away when he knew his time was done, so to speak, and influenced just by his personality. And, Spence reminded us we're just, ordinary people that God uses in extraordinary ways, right? And that's true about each one of us. So I think that's the great blessing. Men and women who have stayed the course at what we call the Campus Church, and are still there, many who are still there. And I just hope and pray, whatever campus you're from, I hope you can see that sticking with it and staying with it and praying through it, what it's led to today. And then I hope those who've come since will continue that, so that there will always be a witness here till the Lord returns.
So tell me a little bit about what the Evangelical Free Church of Naperville was like, day one for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, great church, a great history, God working, moving through its leaders over time. But I think what had happened is they'd been without a senior pastor for a fairly long period of time, several years. And I think they'd lost their sense of mission and vision and where does God want to go. And so I came in, and after a lot of prayer and talking to the staff and the elders, getting to know the congregation, just really started to set a sense of God has more for us than to just, maintain. He wants us to reach this community for Christ. And, eventually that led into kind of a saying I have, here, near, and far. And we just talked about, what does God want to do regionally, here, near, and far, and began to really pursue that. And God was just great. He brought us new people. The church began to grow and expand to the point that we had to build a new worship center and blessed. And God is the one that brought the growth. I was just one of the instruments that He used to help see what was then called EFCN become the Campus Church today.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the addition to the Naperville campus. What were the pinch points that you were feeling? What was that whole process like? Give us a ballpark idea of when that whole project started.
You talk about the multisite?
No, we're talking about just specifically the addition at the Naperville campus.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we were bursting at the seams. And what I would call the old worship center was so full, and people were coming and going, and literally you would just kind of you couldn't get through the atrium area without bumping into somebody. And we just realized that if we were going to move forward, if we were going to grow, we had to create more space. And EFCN had done some church planting in Bolingbrook, Three Rivers, et cetera, and that had been done well and was blessed. But we also believed that God still wanted to do more at Hobson. So again, it was a process of prayer. It was a process of bringing in a consultant to help us kind of take a look at the lay of the land and look at our property and say, is there more that God could do here? And we engaged an architect, Robin Whitehurst, and some others, and began to dream and think and imagine what kind of setting we would need to make an impact in the culture and the kingdom. And from all of that emerged what at that time was a state-of-the-art worship center, and just such a fun tool to use, not just for worship, but it was a great tool to use for teaching. I really enjoyed teaching in that environment. I miss teaching in that environment because, I mean, we had camels on the stage. We had a donkey on the stage. We did a lot of fun things there. And all of that was just a tool to bring the gospel out and to bring hope to people and let them know that church could be a fun place and a safe place and yet still be Christ-centered and Bible-based.
So during your tenure, there were some very substantial changes that happened at the Evangelical Church of Naperville. And let me see if I can get a couple of them in the order that they happened here. The first of that is we moved from one site to more than one site.
Right.
Can you tell us about just the thought, the process of how multi-site conversations started and how you ultimately got to the decision to launch a campus and to do so in South Naperville?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things was it had already been in the heart of what was then EFCN, the Evangelical Free Church in Naperville, to plant churches. And that was about the time when I showed up that multi-siting was becoming kind of the new tool that God was using. It was being very effective. More effective in many ways than church planting, because with church planting, there's quite a risk. You send a group out, and the pastor's kind of on his own, and he's trying to raise money. He's trying to be all things to all people. And the multi-siting idea had with it the sense that you're just multiplying yourself. You're one church. You're just in different locations. So it was one board, one message, one staff team, and then kind of dispersing some staff to the various campuses. So you had that sense of support, that sense of unity, one governing board that kind of kept everything together. And so we began to pray about that. We began to ask ourselves, where is the new growth happening? Let's go meet the new growth. Where are people coming from that are part of what's now known as the Naperville Campus? And the whole area on 95th and West and South was really beginning to explode in growth, and we knew that it was going to take off. And so we prayed and searched and looked and found the location there on 95th, and folks just stepped out in great faith to say, let's see what God's going to do, and look what he's done. You guys now have an actual physical campus down there. I drove by it recently. It's beautiful. It's just great. I'm so excited for Compass to see how God has taken that and then continue to multiply that. And then when God called us away, after being here for 12 years, he brought in Jeff Griffin, who was already well suited for leading multi-site ministry because he had been so involved with that previously. And it's just been really fun to see how God has used Jeff and the entire team to see that whole ministry even multiply further. And just how God has, I look back at it and I go, this is so cool because the children have come back, right? The two church plants, and the mother church is now part of it. So it's just this awesome family, and it's just the providence of God and how he works. So I'm very excited.
So the other thing that happened a little bit after that, if I'm remembering correctly, and we've danced around it a little bit, is we switched names from the Evangelical Free Church of Naperville to what is now the Compass Church. Yeah. What was the thought process behind the why? Let's maybe just even start there.
Well, first of all, Evangelical Free Church in Naperville is a big mouthful.
It is.
Right? And when you're trying to reach a culture that is far from Christ or unfamiliar with Christ, there are some words in there that were not helpful. First of all, evangelical, what does that mean? As an evangelical, we know, but the greater culture doesn't understand that. And unfortunately, the word evangelical has been tainted by some bad behavior by, quote, evangelicals and pastors. And so, people tend to kind of hear evangelical and right away they want to align you with some political group, or they want to align you with some fundamentalist or whatever it is. And we want it to be aligned with Christ and the Bible, not a movement necessarily. Free, what does that mean? What are you free from? Okay? Do I have to give money? Does that mean I don't have to give money? And then Naperville was so provincial, right? It was like, so, and I don't know how it is these days, but, back then, everybody kind of sized you up by where you lived, and even, let's say within Naperville, which subdivision do you live in? And right away, everybody kind of made certain assessments. And we wanted to disband that. We wanted to be a church for people in any community. So, we'll still do business as EFCN, is what we said, but we've got to put a name out there that's more true to what we want to see God accomplish. And so we went to the congregation after we did some marketing research, et cetera, and we presented several different names. And we didn't ask them to vote on the names as much as to say which one resonates the most with you. And the one that resonated the most was compass. And again, it's that sense of direction. God gives us direction. His word, is a lamp, right? His word is a compass, right? And I thought, what an amazing way to be able to talk about your church. And I remember some people were not real happy about that. Can you imagine that, Jake?
Yeah, church people not liking change.
Right.
I understand a little bit.
I didn't quite understand that. But anyway, I remember a few people who were really grumpy about it. But once we decided this is what it's going to be called, and it hit the papers, so to speak, it was interesting to have some of the folks who were grumpy about it come back to me and say, my neighbor asked me why we did it, and they really like it. So it was like, I guess this is okay. So the Compass Church is a great name. I love just how much you can do with that. And I mean, that's why the Compass Church is there, point people to Christ.
So can I put you on the spot a little bit?
Sure.
Do you remember any of the other name options that we were considering before the Compass was landed on?
Oh my goodness.
What could the Compass Church have been called?
I think one of them was the Sanctuary, all right? And that's the only one I can remember. There are a few more.
I remember the Epicenter.
Oh, the Epicenter, of course. How could I forget that? That was like my choice, and it got turned down.
That's probably the California roots coming out a little bit too. And then there was Charis. Am I remember?
Charis for Grace. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like there was like 5 or 6.
Yeah. But the Compass, that's the one.
That's right.
Right.
So that's really fun.
Yeah.
Mixed in with all of that, I feel like branched out as the Compass Church well beyond the walls of our church and well beyond the borders of the United States.
Yeah.
I remember a handful of different things where there was the 50 and 5 initiative. We brought Awana to Southeast Asia. And I know you were passionate and spearheaded a lot of different ends of that.
Yeah.
So could you tell me maybe how that came about? What was the starting point, and what are some of the things you remember being a part of in Southeast Asia in particular?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the church always had a missions heart. It had a great missions team. So that was part of the DNA. And so as the vision emerged, I realized we needed to work on home first. Because it's really easy to say we'll send our money outside and not practice what we ask our missionaries to do. So we really wanted to make sure that the base was doing what we asked people away from our base, so to speak, to do. And once I felt like, we're really starting to be missional in our own backyard, then it was like, well, how do we make sure we get more pointed and have a greater impact beyond ourselves? And so I think, working with Rick Pearson and working with our missions team and just seeing some of our partners, global partners, where God was really at work. Henry, oh my goodness, the ministry,
Henry
Experiencing
Cloud?
God. Henry, no.
Huckabee, no.
No. Anyway, Experiencing God.
Blackaby.
Blackaby, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
We'll get there.
I mean, you're too young to not remember that. Come on, all right? So Henry Blackaby had this saying. He said, see where God is working and join him, okay? So that's basically what we did. We felt and saw God working in a powerful way in Southeast Asia. And so that's where we began to really focus a lot of attention, Vietnam, even up into Nepal. And so I just began going and visiting and doing some training that I kind of wrote up to come alongside those pastors. And that really kind of opened the door. And Marcia went over, my wife, with me and introduced with the Awana leaders this whole program in Vietnam, which didn't have it. And I'm telling you what, it just took off like crazy. It just worked in that culture so well. And I mean, it's been years since I've heard how they're doing, but they had well over 1,000 clubs within a couple of years.
Wow.
Of God at work through Awana. So it's just fun to know that we've been a little part of that. The church was, everybody at the church was so willing to make sacrifices and willing to pray for and willing to let me go and be a part of those places. So we're excited.
So I want to backtrack one step to multisite one more time. So, and I'm going to bring this up just because of my personal relationship. So I have no idea if this will make the cut or not.
Okay.
But Rich Sanford is somebody where I've said more times than not, outside of my parents, has been the person who has intentionally discipled me to the point where I can definitively say I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. I'm wondering, what was it that you saw in Rich that made you think that he would be the person or the best fit to launch our first multi-site campus?
Yeah, Rich is a special guy, and after getting to know him, I saw a passion for Christ, a passion for worship, and a gifted communicator, and somebody who had the attributes of truly being a leader. And he served in the military, and he had that discipline, and he just sensed such a heart for God. I mean, it's like he ate and breathed God and the work of the Lord. So it was not hard. I mean, it's like God presented him to us. We didn't have to go hunting for him. It was like God saying, "Boom, my hand's on this guy." And so it was just a matter of unleashing him, right, and just bringing some mentoring to him and some further encouragement, and helping him get his ministry education down, and just watching what God would do. And I always had a sense that Rich was not going to stay as a campus pastor very long, that God had more that he was preparing him for. And I think that's what happened. I think 95th prepared Rich for what he's doing today there in Utah. So I couldn't be happier. And we've had a lot of great staff here at the campus over the years that God has raised up, like yourself. Like Darcy, like Brett Lilly. I mean, I can go down the list, and it's so fun for me to step back and just see you guys and see what God has done and is continuing to do in your lives. That, to me, is why we exist. That's why church exists. It's to nurture, equip, and release people to go make a difference here, near, and far.
And I love the fact that here, near, and far is still part of the lexicon, and it's ingrained at this point.
I had somebody call me a couple of years ago asking me if they could use here, near, and far at their church, as though I owned it. So, and of course, I've had some churches take here, near, and far, and anyway, I won't go there.
Yeah, I mean, we'll just say based off of Acts 1, yes, by all means.
Yeah, it's his kingdom, so it's great.
Open-ended question here.
Yeah.
Are there any stories, maybe one or two, from your time at EFCN, the campus, that just resonate with you? Something that you look back fondly on, that you remember well, an enjoyable season of ministry? I know that's very open-ended, but I'm wondering if you could share any of those that might come to mind.
Yeah, the first couple of years were hard, right? Because change is always hard, and that's just the way it goes. In those first couple of years, we went through some painful experiences of people deciding, hey, this isn't my church anymore. You changed everything, and we modernized the worship a bit, and we did a lot of that. And I remember one particular meeting when people got pretty upset with me, kind of vocally about the whole thing. And I was driving home, I was going down Book Road, and I just thought to myself, God, what have I done? I left California and a wonderful church, and now that church is hurt. I've come here to this church, and I'm hurting this church. And I'll never forget, Steve Geary called me later or the next day, and was just kind of talking over what was happening. And he made a comment to me that I've never forgotten. And he said this to me. He says, Dale, I want you to remember this. He said, it's not about you, and it's not about them. It's about God and what he wants. And we know what he wants, so let's keep moving forward. And I tell you what, I was like released. And just to know, that somebody who was in leadership, who'd been around for a long time, had the vision to believe that God wanted to do something great, was so encouraging to me. So that's like a pivotal moment for me personally. And then staying the course, and then seeing how God began to bless, how God began to bring people who are talented and gifted. But I think the one memory that I have, and Marcia and I were talking about it recently, where I felt like it catapulted us forward, was when we did 40 Days of Purpose. We brought that program in. Rick Pearson helped kind of lead that whole thing. We got a lot of people involved in it. And as one church, we got our minds off what we didn't like. We got our minds away from all the distractions, and we just focused on God. And how did God create me? What's the shape he gave me? And how does he want to use me? And I tell you, after those 40 days, we were never the same church again. I mean, people found their purpose. They got focused on Christ, and it just took off after that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. At least that's how I remember it, Jay.
That's an important caveat, right?
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that you were the senior pastor when worship style transition was
Yeah.
coming to EFCN.
Right.
I'm sure that was a whole different level of fun
Yeah.
involved with all of that. But
Yeah.
man, it's made so much progress.
Yeah.
And just for you to know, my wife and I started coming, it was November of 2008, and you
Okay.
were doing a year in review. I think was just the sermon series was called
All right.
Year in Review.
Okay.
And I remember walking in, and it's the first time in my life I came to a church and there was a video element mixed into everything that was going on.
Right.
And I remember thinking, that's incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
And then you get up on stage and we're just exceptionally dynamic and well-spoken. And it was the second church my wife and I tried out once we got married and have never left.
Awesome.
So you hook, line, and sinker.
Stay the course.
We're in.
Yeah, praise God.
So tell me a little bit of the end of your time at the Compass Church.
Yeah.
What was that process like? How did you feel God was leading you towards what was next for you and your wife?
Well, first of all, let me just say that Marcia and I were planning to retire in Naperville, okay? We've been here 12 years, and our kids lived in Plainfield. We had grandkids. I loved it when our daughter-in-law or our son would drop the kids off. They'd come running to the house, and I mean, Marcia and I just loved it. It was like, this is life. You know, we get to have two of our grandkids with us all the time. The other two are in Texas, so we make plenty of trips down there. Of course, if we'd had our way, we'd had them all living next to us.
Of course.
But that was just a joyful time. And you know, we were hitting our stride as a church. God was blessing. Overseas was just opening up in tremendous ways. And I got a phone call. And I got a phone call from the head elder and search chair for Wooddale Church up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And he said, I need to talk to you. Could I come have lunch? Well, as soon as he said that, I knew what it was all about. Now, let me give you the backstory. My wife, Marcia's from Minnesota. I went to school up there at Crown College, and that's where I got my Bachelor's of Arts in Bible and Theology. So I was, you know, I've been to Minnesota. I was exposed to Minnesota. And the times that we would go back, we would visit Marcia's, her parents' church, which happened to be Wooddale Church.
Okay.
And I mean, this is way back when we were still young, all right? Didn't have children yet. So I remember one day walking through the corridors of that church and feeling, I can't explain it, all right? Feeling like God is going to call me here. I would have been too boastful to say as senior pastor, right? Because I was just a young guy. But I just had that sense and I left it. It's only happened to me a half a dozen times in my life where that's just, you know, like, so, you know, just it's there in front of you. You wonder, what is this coming from God or what's going on? So, I mean, years later, right? Many, many years later, I'd gone up there for a conference. I met Pat, who was the board chair. I met Leith. You know, I heard different teachings. I found them very helpful. In fact, here at the Compass, I actually brought Pat down and learned a little bit from how Wooddale had done things. So I'd had that kind of history and background. But the moment I got that phone call, I went home and I told Marcia we're leaving. And as sure as I know I'm sitting here with you right now, I knew God was bringing that vision full circle, that had happened, you know, 20-some years before. And one thing led to another, and we obeyed and went. And that was hard. It was hard to leave. I think especially for Marcia, because the grandkids were here and our life was here, and you know, your identity becomes part of this. We had great friends. It was a great place to be, but we sensed God saying, but I put my hand on your life for this many, many years ago, and this is where you're supposed to be. So that's kind of what led us to make that move, and it's been 9 years there now, and it's been interesting, unique to see how God has worked there in many similar kinds of ways, and we're excited about what God has for us. We've started multi-sites. One in downtown Minneapolis, one in Edina. Then we have our main, what I would call hub, which is in Eden Prairie. And since then, we've also begun training house church leaders. So we've got a couple of house churches that really sprung up during COVID. And we've planted 12,000 churches overseas. And our goal is by 2032 to plant another 30,000 churches in Nepal and the northern parts of India, Bangladesh, Tibetan Ridge, and Bhutan. And so that has begun to occupy a lot of my time, and participating in that training, that leadership. So it's another part of God's family that's been a wonderful to be a part of. But I'll say, each setting is unique unto itself. And there are things that I value and love and appreciate about the 12 years that we were here. But Moshe Rosen, who was the founder of Jews for Jesus, said to me something years ago when he and I were having lunch in California when I was pastoring out there. And he said to me, Dale, let me tell you something. God will take some of your best people and he's going to send them other places. Be prepared for it. Well, what he didn't tell me is God may also say to you, when you want to stay someplace, that he has another place for you. And so Marcia and I have always tried to be open to where God would lead us, no matter where it is, even if it's someplace as cold as Minnesota.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And thank you once again to Pastor Dale for his time and sharing his history here at the Compass Church. Before we ever delved into this thing called multisite, we delved into this thing called church planning, starting autonomous individual churches. And one of those churches was the Three Rivers Church, located down in South Plainfield. And one of the cool things about our next guest coming up next week, Eric Fernelli, is that he was born and raised at the Naperville campus of the Compass Church and ultimately moved over to Three Rivers for a couple of different roles. So if you want to find out more about how that all came to be, we'd love to have you join next time on Midweek at the Compass.